Chapter 7 of Seraph's story continues from where Chapter 6 left off. The initiation has concluded, and Team Seraph has finally come together. But it wasn't exactly the steady start to their first year at Shade Academy that Sarah and Zelena were hoping for. Just the opposite, in fact, with one of their team members seemingly out to start trouble. Before that, though, I do want to mention that Team Seraph, and any other original characters that are depicted throughout this story, are the creation of myself, Phoenix Knight, but are brought to life through the work of some amazing artists. HoshiOujo, who helped create the initial designs, and BloodyRosalia, who updated them further. All of their links are in the description down below, and I do highly encourage everyone to check out their other works. Now, if you are new to Team Seraph's story, this is Chapter 7, so I highly recommend you watch the earlier videos to give some added context. The full playlist is linked up above, and I suggest watching in the order that each video was uploaded so you can get the entire story, but with that being said, let's continue the story from where we left off. What's someone from Atlas even doing in Vacuo anyways? Even though she was born in Mistral, Zelena spoke as if she had always lived in Vacuo. It had only been 4 years since she had arrived in the kingdom, but she considered this her home and was willing to defend it. A silver lining in an unfortunate situation, Sarah thought. Sarah, Piers, and Zelena had just left the auditorium, and were making their way down a wide stone hallway. After the team announcements had concluded, they were sent their room assignments via their scrolls, and now the 3 of them were making their way to the dorms. Hesper, of course, was nowhere to be found. She had strode off, quite pleased with herself after antagonizing half of their class. "I wanted to fight her, you know," Zelena said, turning to Sarah, still agitated over Hesper's words. "I'm sure you'll get your chance," Sarah reasoned. "It's unlikely she'll change her tune overnight, regardless of who wins tomorrow." The exasperation was evident in her voice. Sarah remembered what she had said earlier that day about giving Elysians the benefit of the doubt. Looks like Zelena might have been right after all, she thought to herself. "If I'm going to get to fight her anyway, then why did you cut in now?" Zelena inquired. It was rare for Zelena to get this annoyed with her, but Sarah knew how stubborn her partner could be, and given how much Hesper had pushed it, she was making her displeasure known. Sarah sighed. "Look, I know how she got on your nerves. Heck, she got on the nerves of everyone within earshot, but she made it pretty clear that I was her main target. It wouldn't exactly look good for our team if its leader let someone else fight for them after being called out like that," Sarah explained, standing her ground. "Hesper drew a lot of attention to herself, and us as a result. If we don't make it clear that we don't approve of her attitude, she's going to drag us all down with her." Zelena thought for a moment. She understood what Sarah was saying, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. "Do you think you can win?" Piers asked, a few paces behind the girls. "Honestly, I don't know, but I'd like to think I'll be able to hold my own against her. Though I've only seen her fight the Seraph, and that really didn't give me any insight, other than the fact that she seemed to be having the time of her life," Sarah replied. "No kidding, she's nuts," Piers said, putting his hands behind his head as they continued walking. "She seemed to be pretty interested in you, though," Zelena interjected, directing her comment at Piers. "And it looked like you two encountered each other before the Seraph. Shouldn't you know something that might help?" Having accepted Sarah's rationale, Zelena was now looking for ways to help. "Actually, now that you mention it, she did hit me hard enough to send me flying, but I don't know how she did it even though we fought," Piers replied. "That was probably gravity dust," Zelena explained matter-of-factly. "That's what she used to propel herself and finish the Seraph." "So that's what that purple flash was. Okay, I'll have to be careful of that," Sarah thought out loud as she considered her strategy for tomorrow. Of course she'd have gravity dust, that privileged little... Wait, did you say you two fought? Did she attack you? "If we tell a professor, maybe we could get her put on a different team!" Zelena exclaimed. "I doubt it," Piers sighed. "We're at Shade Academy now, not the combat training schools. It's survival of the fittest here. This is where we're supposed to learn how to handle ourselves as huntsmen. We're supposed to be able to protect people from Grimm, not to mention bandits. We need to be able to hold our own, so fights between students probably aren't that high on the teacher's priority list. Heck, if what Hesper said is true, then fights are even encouraged." Piers hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Plus, I was kind of the one who attacked her, so..." Zelena stopped in place and turned on Piers. So it's your fault we're stuck with the loony Elysian on our team? She yelled. I guess when you put it that way, but look, it's not like I meant to attack her, Piers tried to explain. My semblance blinds me temporarily. She showed up right after I fought some Grim and... Oh, great. So what I'm hearing is that you're a liability, Zelena retorted. Piers couldn't deny that there was some truth to what she said, but her attitude rubbed him the wrong way. Right, that's rich, coming from someone who doesn't even look like they could fight their way out of a paper bag, he pushed back. Alright, that's enough, you two. Sarah raised her voice, having enough of the arguments. It was clear that Hesper had them all on edge, but if this continued, it would tear them apart before they even had the chance to be a team. It's bad enough that we already have one fight between members of our team. We don't need more. Well, she started it, Piers pointed at Zelena as he spoke. Yes, well, although she can be a bit harsh, Zelena is right. Not being able to see in the middle of a fight isn't exactly great, Sarah said, shutting Piers down. Ha, see? Zelena exclaimed, smiling smugly at Piers. Of course you'd take her side. I see how it... Sarah cut Piers off before he could finish. But Zelena, Piers has a point too. You should know better than anyone that you're not the most suited to frontline combat, Sarah said. The look of shock on Zelena's face, as though Sarah had turned against her, made Piers burst into a laughter that almost brought tears to his eyes. But speaking of combat, with your semblance, limiting your sight, how well do you compensate for it, Piers? The question had caught him off guard. Huh? I think I do all right, Piers said, sheepishly, his laughter subsiding. Ah, so that thing you just mentioned with Hesper counts as all right, in your mind? Zelena quipped before Sarah could reply. Sarah shot Zelena a look, to which she responded by looking off in the opposite direction, while feigning a whistle and pretending not to notice. Piers had no response to Zelena's comment, though. Well, lucky for you both, we're a team now, Sarah declared with a smile. And that means from here on out, we're going to help each other. Piers and Zelena shared a glance, the expression on Sarah's face slightly unsettling them both. So, Piers, meet your new eyes on the battlefield. Listen to Zelena's direction in combat, and you'll be just fine. Zelena, from here on out, please do for Piers what you've always done for me and support us both with your dust and strategy. All right? Excellent. Let's look forward to working together, Sarah said with a cheer as she turned on her heel and continued walking. Piers and Zelena watched as their leader walked away, dumbfounded by what just happened. Is she always this bossy? Piers asked. This is the first I'm seeing of it, Zelena replied. They both looked at each other and nodded in agreement of a truce as they followed their leader to their dorm room. After a few more minutes of walking, the group finally arrived at their destination. The room they had been assigned was small. 2 bunk beds lined the right wall, while the other side of the room had a single tiny desk, with barely any storage space. It was barely enough room for 2 people, let alone 4, but in Vacuo, you made do with what you had. Zelena was shocked to see that there wasn't a division between male and female sleeping arrangements. So, who's getting the top bunks? Piers asked, casually glossing over the fact that he was the lone boy in a room with 3 girls. Just so you know, if you try anything, you'll be sleeping outside. And by that, I mean outside the city walls, Zelena said, turning on Piers once again. Try what? Piers asked defensively, genuinely unaware of the situation. You can't be serious. Are you really that innocent or just that dumb? Zelena asked. Piers looked to Sarah for some clarity. We're girls, you're a guy, Sarah motioned for him to put it together. Hey, whoa, I didn't do anything. Why are you assuming I'm some pervert? Piers exclaimed, thrown off by the accusation. We all slept in the auditorium last night, and it was fine, right? Yeah, well, that was for one night. This is the place we'll be sleeping regularly. And where we'll be changing clothes. Understand? Zelena explained. Piers's face turned bright red at Zelena's words. That's it, get out! Zelena yelled, realizing what Piers had been thinking. You're the one who put the thought in my head. I would never even think of doing anything like that, he yelped. I value my life. All right, Zelena, you've had your fun. Give him a break, Sarah chimed in. In truth, though, we do need to set some ground rules. You're right that nothing happened in the auditorium, but it almost did. Early in the morning, we did see someone sneaking around in the dark doing who knows what. Piers realized immediately that she was referring to him. Oh, actually, about that. He paused for a moment as he decided what to say. It'd be easy enough to lie since they didn't know who it was, but that wasn't exactly the way Piers wanted to start off the relationship with his new team. I think that was me who you were referring to. I slept in the middle of the room and, well, I couldn't find the bathroom in the dark, Piers admitted, bracing himself for Zelena's reaction. Her tongue flicked back and forth as Piers spoke. He had fully expected her to let him have it, but after a brief pause, she sighed. At least that's one mystery solved, was all Zelena said on the matter, a response that surprised both of her teammates. You're taking this rather well, Sarah teased, now that we're rooming with a guy who skulks around during the night. Hey, don't set her off on me again, Piers pleaded. He could have lied, but he didn't, so I'm not going to hold it against him, Zelena groaned. The frustration was clear in her tone of voice, but it wasn't due to Piers's mistakes. She didn't like the fact that she was, reluctantly, starting to have some respect for him. He's an idiot, Zelena jabbed, but at least he's an honest idiot. Piers breathed a sigh of relief. I'm glad we were able to clear that up, he said, not bothering to acknowledge the fact that she called him an idiot. With that settled, Sarah and I will take the 2 bunks next to the wall. You and Crazy get the 2 next to the door, Zelena decided for them. What? Don't I get a say? Piers asked. I figured dividing it up by partners was the easiest way to go about it, rather than all of us arguing over who gets what, Zelena responded. Piers couldn't really argue with her logic, but still, easy enough for you to say. You don't have Hesper as your partner, Piers said, giving Zelena a side-eye. Glad we understand each other, Zelena grinned mischievously. If she was stuck with him, she'd at least be able to have some fun. Oh, and by the way, Piers, you probably want to choose the bottom bunk. Oh, and why's that? Piers asked sarcastically. Well, with how you stumble around in the dark, just imagine Hesper's reaction if you stepped on her while climbing down from the bunk. Piers shuddered at the thought. Noted, he said, tossing his bag onto the bottom bunk. While they were all unpacking, Piers sent a message to Niall, hoping for some advice. Hey, how does your team handle having guys and girls in the same room? We just split it down the middle. Guys on one side, girls on the other. Worked pretty well for us, was his response. I'm the only guy on my team, though. Oh, right, Niall said. Well, good luck, then. A lot of help he is, Piers thought. Oh well, this was the hand he was dealt. May as well do what he could to make it work. Right now, though, there was a more pressing matter. Dealing with Hesper. By the time they were settled, it was almost dusk. The day's events weighing on each of them, Sarah, Zelena, and Piers were ready to pass out. They stumbled to the cafeteria to quickly get something to eat, and upon returning, they had discovered that Hesper had made her way to the room in their absence, but was still nowhere to be found, her lone bag resting on the only unclaimed bunk. None of them really paid it any mind. They promptly made their way to their respective beds to rest in preparation for what awaited them the following day. Soon, the sound of Piers and Zelena sleeping could be heard. Sarah, on the other hand, was a bit more restless than the others, knowing she'd have to fight Hesper the following day, and it took a bit longer for sleep to find her. At some point, though, just as she was drifting off, she heard Hesper return. Like a whisper in the night, she made minimal noise, as she too promptly went to sleep. Hesper had left the room early in the morning, before anyone else woke up. They saw her in class, but while most teams sat together, as Sarah, Zelena, and Piers did, Hesper instead chose to seclude herself at the back of the room. Thinks she's too good for us, I bet, Zelena muttered as they sat down. She wasn't the only one to carry that sentiment. There were murmurs throughout the class as people glanced, or more appropriately, glared at the girl from Atlas in their midst. Some were also looking at Sarah as well, sizing her up to see if she was up to the task of dealing with their Atlesian problem. Hesper, in turn, seemed to revel in the attention, returning the glares that she received with a smug smile. Her attention was also more focused on Sarah than anyone else. sizing up the opponent she would soon face. It made for an exhausting first day of classes, but soon enough it became time for Hesper and Sera to face one another. Although Sera would have rather found a different way to coexist with her, Hesper had put them in a position where this was the only outcome. Though her anger over Hesper's words had diminished overnight, it didn't go away completely, and Sera was resolved to see this fight through. She would prove to Hesper that Vacuo, and most of all her team, shouldn't be taken lightly. They were having their match in one of the smaller arenas, so as to avoid interfering with other students. Although not as large as the main training hall, which was meant to accommodate students of every year training throughout the day, this room was still sizable. With a central area 100 feet in diameter, the curved stone walls encompassed the stage where they would fight. A raised seating area lined the arena in a semicircle, perfect for onlookers to watch as the match was being held. These rooms were intended for training smaller groups, so everyone could learn from those sparring in the ring and the professors could offer instruction as the students fought. Now, however, this room was Sera's battlefield. A number of their classmates had come to watch as well, eagerly awaiting a fight, and, standing in the center of the ring, lance at her side, waited her opponent. Sera half expected Hesper to be taunting her, much like Niall had when they had fought, but instead, Hesper waited patiently for Sera to come face her. Sera, Piers, and Zelena approached the edge of the ring. She nodded to her teammates as she continued onward, leaving them in their front row seats for the battle that was about to unfold. "Sorry to make you wait," Sera said as she walked down the stone steps into the arena. "No need to apologize. I just hope you make it worth my time," Hesper jeered. A thin smile spread across her lips. "You'd better give it everything you've got, Birdie, or you might end up getting hurt." "Oh, don't worry. I won't be holding back," Sera said as she drew her blades. And she meant it, too. Remembering the clash against the Zeraf, and how quickly Hesper was able to end it, Sera knew that if she was going to win, she couldn't afford to pull her punches. She glanced over at her team. "Piers, we'll start on your signal," she called to him. Sera paused as she met Zelena's eye and smiled to reassure her partner, before turning her full attention to the opponent in front of her. The instant the start of the match was called, Hesper burst forwards, trying to catch her opponent off guard, with a lunge straight towards her torso. Thanks to the information that she had obtained from Piers, Sera anticipated that Hesper would attack first. But the speed at which she threw herself into the fight was startling. Instead of being caught off guard, though, Sera leapt forwards as well, angling herself slightly to the left of Hesper's attack. She parried the lance using the blade in her left hand, and carried the momentum around as she turned 360 degrees to strike Hesper's side with the blade in her right. To Sera's surprise, Hesper was able to react to her counterattack, pulling her lance back just enough to block the blow with its hilt, though not entirely. Although she was able to reduce the impact, Sera's blade carried through, grazing Hesper's side as she did. Both huntresses in training turned on their heels. "Quite an impressive reaction time," Hesper chided, her smile widening. "Right back at you," Sera returned the compliment. Sera had attacked knowing what Hesper would do, but Hesper's reaction to Sera's attack was without any forewarning. She certainly had the skill to back up her words. Even so, Sera had landed a hit. It wasn't anything to celebrate just yet, but it was a start. "She got her!" Piers cheered from the sidelines. "That was just the opening strike," Zelena corrected, trying to temper Piers's expectations, and in turn, her own. "The real fight is just beginning." She believed in Sera more than anyone else, but she also knew better than to assume the outcome in any battle as a sure thing. "How about this, then?" Hesper said as she began unleashing a flurry of blows towards Sera. Hesper's attacks came in quick succession, with little time to counter. She wasn't overextending like she had with her first attack. Instead, she kept Sera at the optimal distance and targeted her lance at any opening she could see with pinpoint accuracy. Sera did the best she could to block, but Hesper's weapon carried more weight than hers, making it difficult to parry with her blades while also trying to keep her footing. Sera was able to stave off any direct hits, but after a few glancing blows landed to her left hip and shoulder, she knew she had to try something different in order to create an opening. Sarah jumped backwards as she parried Hesper's next attack. Without hesitation, Hesper moved forwards to close the newly created gap. Sarah took advantage of Hesper's speed by quickly shifting her weight and darting towards her, just as she had done with the opening strike. This time, though, she parried the lance with her wing and spun to the right to close the distance between them. As she did so, she swung the blade in her left hand, causing Hesper to block just as she had before. Now, however, Sarah had positioned herself to follow it up with an upward slash from the blade in her right hand. Just as Icarus was about to make contact, there was a bright purple flash. Sarah was hit point blank with an overwhelming force that flung her backwards, slamming her into the wall on the opposite side of the arena. She had been able to use her wings to marginally slow her speed mid-air to lessen the blow, but the force as she hit the stone was still enough to cause her grip to loosen. Her swords flew out of her hands, landing in the sand a few feet in front of her. Being the first time she experienced it, Sarah was a bit dazed from the power of the gravity dust she had been hit with. Hesper had also been in close proximity to the burst when she activated it, and had even been knocked back to the opposite side of the arena, but seemed altogether unfazed. Sarah took this chance to check their aura readings. Her aura was now around 70% after that hit, but Hesper didn't escape unscathed either. Whether due to Sarah's attack connecting, or due to her own gravity dust, Hesper had taken some damage too. Right now, they were even. "Seems like your wings still have some uses after all," Hesper quipped. "But they'll still be the cause of your defeat." She pointed her lance at Sarah, bracing it with both hands to steady her weapon, as the head of the lance began to spin. Sarah, sensing an impending lunge, made a move to grab her blades. She pushed off the wall in a motion to dive, attempting to avoid Hesper's attack. But she didn't get that far. Before she had taken so much as 2 steps away from it, she felt herself being pulled back towards the stone behind her. To the astonishment of everyone, Sarah most of all, threads of metal began wrapping around her, and she soon found herself pinned to the wall she had just tried to push off of. Sarah attempted to pull herself free, but despite how frail they appeared, the thin threads kept her firmly bound in place. As she struggled to free herself, Sarah saw that at the end of each thread was a thin needle. That was all that was holding her? How? Sarah wondered. But upon closer inspection, she saw the faint purple glow that the needles were emitting, and the answer became clear. It was gravity dust. "Where did that come from?" Piers exclaimed, seeing the threads shot from Hesper's lance binding Sarah to the wall. So, her weapon can fire metal threads to ensnare her opponents. Zelena, having put her anger aside to support Sarah, was calmly analyzing the situation. Piers remembered how Hesper's lance spun during their fight. Her weapon didn't do that when I fought her. He knew that Hesper was only toying with him during the initiation, but it was frustrating to realize just how much she was holding back, and he still struggled against her. "I doubt she was hiding it intentionally," Zelena said, noticing the defeated look on Piers's face. She offered an answer to his troubled thoughts. "The threads wouldn't have helped against the Seraph, and with your strength, she probably realized they weren't enough to restrain you, so she chose not to use them. Don't beat yourself up too much." Sarah was right. They'd have to start working together at some point, so she may as well offer some support. She didn't necessarily like the fact that she was stuck with Niall's brother on her team, but at least it wasn't as bad as having Niall himself. "Besides," Zelena continued, "Hesper wasn't the only one who didn't show all of her tricks in that fight." "What do you mean?" Piers asked. "Just watch and you'll see," Zelena said, the corner of her mouth curling upwards into a sly smile. "Oh my, look at that, a little bird caught in a web," Hesper scoffed as she sauntered towards Sarah, acting as though the fight was already over. Sarah pulled as hard as she could to try to free herself, but it was no use. Each of her limbs and her wings were completely immobilized by the threads. Hesper was pointing the gravity dust crystal at the end of her lance towards Sarah, anchoring the needles to the wall. Against many opponents, this situation probably would have ended the fight. But Sarah wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. "Don't struggle too hard, Birdie, or you might hurt yourself," Hesper chuckled. Then, all of a sudden, flames erupted from the wings of her trapped prey, causing Hesper to halt her approach. Sarah had activated the fire dust in the daggers lining her wings, causing a large expulsion of fire and heat. Wow, that's quite the show! But you'll need more than that if you're trying to escape my threads, she taunted. As the flames dissipated, Hesper's words were revealed to be true. Sarah was still bound in place. Her fire was unable to free her from her restraints. With her efforts to free herself proving unsuccessful, Sarah stopped struggling, her body now limp against the threads restraining her. Looks like that's all you had, Hesper said, shrugging and shaking her head, the disappointment clear in her voice. As she spoke, Hesper momentarily dropped her gaze, and that was all the opportunity Sarah needed. By the time Hesper's eyes returned to her opponent, she was met with half a dozen daggers hurtling in her direction. She twirled her lance in an attempt to block them, but she couldn't catch them all. The blades that were blocked burst on impact, while others grazed her left cheek, right side, and outer left thigh, causing her aura to glisten slightly at the points of contact. Thanks to Hesper's overconfidence, Sarah was back in the lead, if only slightly. Sarah casually strode forward from the wall and picked up her weapons as if she hadn't struggled at all, molten threads falling to the ground as she did so. It had taken a bit of effort, but using her semblance, she had absorbed the heat from the fire dust and successfully concentrated it to the points where the threads were contacting her body. That pushed the metal past its melting point and freed her from the web spun by her opponent. You really should wait until after a fight is finished to start gloating, or else one of these days you might just get burned. Sarah returned some of Hesper's attitude back to her. It really seems like you're the one holding back. Hesper's face lit up. Oh, you have some surprises left, I see, Hesper said with a gleeful laugh, now grinning ear to ear. This is getting fun. Hesper pointed her lance at Sarah again, the head beginning to spin once more. Sarah knew what was coming this time, and she wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Hesper had positioned herself in the center of the circular arena. Sarah, on the other hand, was still close to the wall. There wasn't enough time to rush Hesper before she'd once again be snared by threads. So instead, Sarah opted for an alternate approach. She took off running, counterclockwise around the perimeter of the arena, just as Hesper began firing her needles, following Sarah's path along the wall. Sarah ducked, jumped, and rolled out of the way, avoiding being caught by Hesper's threads again as she circled around, slowly closing the gap between them. Once Sarah was close enough, Hesper swung her lance, trying to sweep Sarah's feet out from under her. This was the opportunity Sarah was waiting for. She kicked off the ground towards Hesper, and vaulted over her, twisting her body as she did so. Sarah avoided Hesper's lance by a hair's width, and used both of her swords to strike her opponent's weapon, sending the tip of her lance towards the ground. Sarah continued her mid-air spin, and struck Hesper's back as she passed with each of her blades. She wasn't able to put her full weight behind it, but it was the first clean hit that Sarah had landed in this fight, and she wasn't about to let up. Upon landing, she slid to a halt and pushed off, lunging at Hesper with both of her blades. Hesper turned and blocked the blow with her lance, interlocking her weapon with Sarah's crossed blades. "Looks like you've finally gotten serious, Birdie," Hesper howled. "I suppose it's about time that I do the same." Hesper pushed Sarah's blades away and somersaulted backwards, intercepting Sarah's counterattack with the kick of her feet as she did so. Sarah's blades were knocked upwards, but she kept them firmly in her grasp. Sarah hardly had time to recenter her stance before Hesper made her move. The Elysian girl had vaulted backwards, and the moment that her feet touched the ground, she jumped into the air, pointing the gravity dust crystal in her lance towards Sarah. As Hesper let loose another blast of gravity dust, Sarah braced herself, crossing her weapons in front of her and spreading her wings to cushion the blow. Although she was pushed back a few feet, she had been able to remain standing, and now it was Sarah who was positioned in the center of the arena. Hesper, on the other hand, had been mid-air when she used the dust, and was sent flying towards the wall. Or at least, that's what Sarah had thought. But before she could react, Hesper was right in front of her, and moving fast. Sarah felt a blow land to her side. She recovered her footing and turned on her heel to face her opponent, only to find that Hesper was on top of her again. Narrowly able to dodge out of the way this time, Sarah watched as Hesper passed by. With a maniacal grin stretched across her face, the eyes of her opponent gleamed with excitement. Sera met her gaze, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Sera watched as Hesper kicked off the ground and landed on thin air in front of the curved wall, only for her to then spring forwards much faster than she had been able to up until now. Sera barely had time to move before it happened again. It took a moment for Sera to realize what was going on. Thanks to Hesper's previous assault, her threads now lined the curved wall of the arena. She was now using them as a way to boost her speed and attack from every direction. Zelena was watching Hesper's actions intently from the sidelines. Restraining opponent was one thing, but using them as a springboard? Zelena thought to herself. Hesper was using the gravity dust crystal in her lance to repel the needles the moment she landed on the string and keep them in place, so she could use them for mobility. Her lance had the capacity to let out gravity dust in a burst, or at a constant rate. Combined with its ability to rotate and fire threads, Zelena hated to admit it, but her weapon was intricately designed. Her fighting style, though, was borderline insanity. It was unlike anything Zelena had seen before. One wrong move, and she'd be crashing headlong into a wall. On its surface, there were many openings that an opponent could take advantage of, but her unpredictable nature made it nearly impossible. And Hesper had trained herself to deal with not only her opponent's unpredictable actions, but also her own. How long must she have fought to be able to do this? Zelena wondered. Hesper's onslaught of attacks continued, the power behind her strikes amplified by her momentum. Sera was doing her best to hold on, but her aura was slowly depleting. Every time she dodged Hesper's lance, she'd be met with a swift kick as Hesper passed by. If she blocked, the impact would push her back, disrupting her footing and leaving her unable to avoid the next attack. Time was running out. Sera needed to do something, and fast, otherwise she was done for. She narrowly avoided Hesper's next attack, and the moment that Hesper passed by, Sera gripped her weapons and spun in place, activating her fire dust as she did so. She created a vortex of flame that momentarily masked her from Hesper's view. Now, Hesper would either have to halt her movement and wait for Sera to move, or she'd have to charge in blindly. Waiting while Sera depleted her dust and her aura would be the smartest option available to her, but that wild expression that Hesper wore betrayed what she would do in such a situation. Sera trusted in the tenacity of her opponent, and, without a moment's hesitation, jumped to the side as if to dodge an incoming attack that she didn't know was there. Right on cue, her opponent burst through the flames, aiming for the center of the swirling fire. Sera, now firmly positioned to the side of where Hesper was aiming, took full advantage of the opening. And just as Hesper came within reach, she ignited the dust in her blades, and used her semblance to funnel all the remaining heat she could muster into her weapons. Intending to finish the fight here, Sera brought both of her blades down as hard as she could. In a flurry of flames, the clash of metal echoed throughout the room. The vortex of fire dissipated as Hesper breached its side, tumbling across the floor. The vanishing flame revealed Sera still standing at its center, breathing hard. A cheer erupted from the crowd, not so much in support of Sera, but more so celebrating Hesper's downfall. Regardless of what it was for, Sera had more than left an impression on the crowd as well as her opponent. But the fight wasn't over just yet. Although it seemed like her senses were lost in the throes of battle, Hesper had reacted to Sera's attack once again, twisting her body midair and pulling her lance back across her body to block the hit. But it wasn't enough to nullify the attack. Sera's blades had connected with Hesper's lance, slamming her into the sandy floor. Due to her momentum and the perpendicular force of Sera's attack, Hesper was sent sprawling diagonal to where Sera was standing. She rolled across the sand for a few feet before recovering her footing, sliding to a halt, using both of her feet and her left hand to slow herself, while her right hand kept a firm grip on her lance. Hesper's aura shimmered as she stood once more. "Excellent!" Hesper howled through heavy breaths. "This is just the kind of fight I was hoping for!" Even though her aura had dropped to 10%, she was more fired up than ever before. Sera's aura was also reaching its limit, now below 15% from Hesper's attacks. The next solid blow would decide the outcome of the fight. "Sera's going to win!" Piers exclaimed. "It's not over yet," Zelena reminded him. With someone as unpredictable as Hesper, there was no telling how this would end. Her attacks had become wilder the longer the fight had dragged on, but Sarah could handle that. It was something else that was keeping Zelena on edge. The battle was almost over, but Hesper hadn't used her semblance. Was it just not useful in combat, Zelena wondered? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. Sarah and Hesper resumed their clash in the center of the arena. As before, thanks to the extra points of contact that her wings provided, and by using the range of Hesper's lance against her, Sarah began to gain the upper hand. Zelena could see, though, even from where she was sitting, that Hesper was allowing herself to be pushed back. Instead of creating a distance that was more favorable to herself, Hesper kept the fight close. On the surface, it seemed like this was just due to her crazy nature, not making the most thought-out decisions. But Zelena could tell that Hesper was intentionally leaving small openings, baiting Sarah to attack where she wanted, and was leading her towards the wall. Something definitely wasn't right. Instead of focusing on the clash itself, Zelena began to look for any hint of what Hesper could be planning. Just as Hesper was closing in on the wall, she parried Sarah's attack with her lance, and vaulted backwards, landing once again on what seemed to be thin air. Sarah realized immediately that Hesper had landed on one of her threads lining the room. She charged forward, expecting Hesper to jump at her, but when she struck, her blades only caught thin air. Instead of going forward, Hesper had used the strings to vault upwards. Sarah watched as Hesper began darting up the curved wall of the arena, bounding across numerous threads that she had placed earlier. What's she doing? Zelena wondered from the crowd. Hesper was just scaling the walls. That wouldn't win her the match unless she had some way of attacking. The threads, she realized. If Hesper got to a high enough vantage point, she could fire her threads downwards and there wouldn't be anywhere Sarah could go to get away from them. Was this just another way for Hesper to mock Sarah, since she wasn't able to use her wings to reach her? Zelena wondered. Sarah, on the other hand, didn't know what Hesper was planning, but she wouldn't let her get away. Sarah turned and flapped both of her wings towards Hesper, launching a volley of daggers at her opponent. The blades rained on Hesper as she scaled the wall, causing her to jump back. Out of the dozen daggers that Sarah threw, only one needed to hit its mark. As they collided with the wall, the impact caused the remaining fire dust to burst in small explosions. Hesper avoided all of them, aware that Sarah would try something. But unbeknownst to Hesper, Sarah wasn't aiming for her. She was instead aiming for her footing, the needles anchoring the thread that Hesper was jumping towards. Just as Hesper was about to land on the next thread, Sarah's daggers connected, the small burst of fire dust knocking loose the needle. Hesper went to put her weight on it, and found herself with nothing underfoot. As soon as she saw Hesper beginning to fall, Sarah leapt into action. She jumped towards the wall, and kicked off with as much force as she could muster, flapping her wings to give her as much height as possible. She would intercept Hesper mid-air, and land the finishing blow before she could reorient herself. Even if Hesper tried to use her gravity dust to push Sarah away, she knew that it would affect Hesper as well, and, with her current orientation mid-air, she'd have a hard time landing safely. While Sarah could slow her descent with her wings, Hesper would be sent crashing to the ground. Hesper was trapped, with no way out. From the stands, Zelena could see everything clearly. Sarah had Hesper dead to rights. This ought to knock that girl's arrogance down a peg, Zelena thought, her excitement growing as she watched Sarah leap for the final strike. Only for it to come crashing down a moment later. Oh no. Zelena's eyes widened. With everyone else focused on the fight, Zelena was sure that she was the only one who noticed. As her partner leapt into the air, Zelena had caught a glimmer of something fluttering behind Sarah. If not for the light of an open window hitting it just at the right angle, she would have missed it too. Dangling from Sarah's wing was a needle. Now that she had become aware of what to look for, Zelena then noticed another, and another. There were more than half a dozen of them, all seeming to float behind Sarah, following her as she jumped. Hesper had made an obvious show of using her gravity dust needles, but that was only part of her trick. She must have mixed them in with the regular ones on her first attack, Zelena thought. Had she planned this from the start? Was everything up until this point just her way of toying with Sarah? Zelena's thoughts were racing. The needles that were dangling from Sarah's wings were attached to threads. but ones much more discreet than those Hesper had used up until now. Threads not made of metal, but of aura. A thread so thin and light that no one would notice unless they were looking for it. Zelena wanted to call out, to warn her friend, but she knew that doing so would be an insult to the efforts that Sera had put forward up until now. She would just have to watch and have faith that Sera could overcome whatever Hesper had in store, just as she had done so many times already throughout this fight. Hesper was mere inches out of Sera's striking range now. She moved her weapon, and Sera could see the gravity dust in her lance beginning to glow. But Sera paid it no mind. It didn't matter what Hesper had planned now. Sera brought both of her weapons together in front of herself, and slashed at her opponent, expecting them to connect along Hesper's midsection. But just as they had before, Sera's blades caught nothing. She could see her target right in front of her, but she missed? Had she miscalculated the reach of her blades? Sera wondered. But no, it only took a second for Sera to realize that her momentum had been somehow halted mid-air, and even more so, she was beginning to fall downwards. She didn't understand how Hesper had done it, but the grin stretched across her face made it clear that she was responsible. Sera was so close to victory that she could almost grasp it, but now, with Hesper looming in the air slightly above her, preparing to attack, her chance at victory was about to slip away. She moved to attack with her daggers, only to find that she couldn't move her wings. It was as if they were the very things pulling her towards the ground. There was only one option left if Sera wanted a chance to win in this situation, and she didn't hesitate to grasp it. Hesper had fought many opponents, but very few had given her this much enjoyment. The back and forth, not knowing who would win or lose, it was just the kind of thrill that she lived for. But now the battle had reached its end. Hesper watched as the winged girl began to fall beneath her. She had turned Sera's attack against her. Now all that was left was to finish it. And then the light reflected off of something metallic, something that had been thrown in her direction. Hesper twisted her body mid-air, narrowly avoiding Sera's blade that had been thrown. As it passed by, an inch from her nose, Hesper caught a glimpse of her own shocked expression. She threw one of her weapons to buy time? Hesper thought. This girl is something else. Her eyes were wide with glee as she turned her attention back to Sera, only to catch sight of another metallic glimmer, a split second before she felt the stinging pain of a blade across her stomach. She threw both of her weapons without a second thought? The realization caused Hesper's mind to race. Zelena let go of her apprehension as she watched Sera's sword connect with Hesper's abdomen. This was it, Zelena thought, as she cheered for her partner. The shocked look on Hesper's face made it clear that she never expected this attack. Sera had won! Or so it seemed. But the cruel truth that every huntsman and huntress learns at one point or another is that fate in battle is often unforgiving. Zelena's apprehension that had dissipated came swirling back as it turned to dread. Her arms that were just raised in the air in celebration now dropped limp to her side as Hesper's aura flickered and didn't break. Only a sliver of her aura remained, but it was enough to keep her in the fight. Had Sera been at a slightly better angle, had she thrown her weapon a millisecond sooner, the outcome might have been different. But now the fight belonged to the victor. Hesper's face was alight with joy at Sera's determination to win. Even before it was clear that her aura would stay intact, she was preparing her next move, engulfed by the thrill of their fight. With a quick flip of her lance to position the gravity dust crystal behind herself, and a final flash of purple, it was over. Hesper propelled herself towards Sera, her right knee connecting squarely in the center of Sera's torso, the force of the blow carrying through as Hesper's attack sent them both plummeting to the ground. The impact with the sandy floor shattered Sera's aura and drove Hesper's knee further into her stomach, forcing every last bit of air from her lungs. As the dust settled, Hesper removed her knee from Sera's chest and got to her feet, cackling as she did so. Her defeated opponent left crumpled on the ground, gasping for breath. You certainly don't hold back, do you, Seraphina? Hesper exclaimed. Sarah, while trying and failing to catch her breath, could only look up at the girl talking over her. Her eyes were watering from the pain, but even through her blurred vision, Sarah could see the delight in Hesper's expression. It was clear that she had enjoyed every second of their clash. She was practically dancing around Sarah as she spoke, relishing in her victory. Most people would have tried to block an attack like that, not try to counter, let alone throw both of their weapons. You went for the win instead of worrying about defeat. Hesper was overjoyed as she spoke. Her laughter then subsided as she knelt down next to Sarah. That was a real all-or-nothing gamble. You have my respect, she said, commending her opponent. The gleeful expression on Hesper's face then became more serious, as she lowered her voice so only Sarah could hear. I know it might not mean much at this point, but I take back what I said. Whatever the situation was that took your wings, it must have been a terrible struggle. I'm sorry. Under most circumstances, an apology to the person you just defeated was ridiculous, but after the way Hesper had acted leading up to the fight, why would she be saying this? Sarah wondered. Her lungs were still screaming as she tried to breathe, but she could tell that Hesper's words were sincere. In fact, she seemed almost in pain as she spoke, as if her own words were wounding her. Sarah didn't have much time to sort out her thoughts, though, as Zelena and Piers had arrived. Get away from her! Zelena yelled, her blood boiling with rage. Hesper stood as the rest of their team reached the ring, resuming her regular demeanor. You might want to help our leader up. She seems to be having some trouble catching her breath. Hesper smiled as she turned her back on them and walked to the center of the ring. She raised her lance into the air and activated her gravity dust once more. From the walls around them and the sand beneath their feet, all of the gravity dust needles that she had used throughout the fight were swiftly drawn to their master. I certainly can't let any of my dust go to waste, Hesper chided as she turned to face the crowd. It's not like I'll be able to find any replacements around here. And with that final insult to the home of everyone there, Hesper made her exit from the stage. Zelena glared at Hesper as they passed each other. The disrespect that Hesper had shown Sarah was something Zelena couldn't forgive. Picking a fight was one thing, but the way she fought, as if mocking the fact that Sarah couldn't fly, and then to laugh while celebrating her victory at the end. Zelena would get her for this, but right now the concern she felt for her partner outweighed her desire for revenge, and she rushed to Sarah's side. Zelena and Piers were too focused on her to see it themselves, but Sarah could swear that she saw Hesper's confident smile waver as she reached the edge of the arena, just before she disappeared from view. Sarah, are you okay? Zelena asked as she reached her partner. Sarah nodded while continuing to inhale deeply. She had managed to catch her breath, but the pain in her lungs had yet to fully dissipate. You are awesome, Piers exclaimed. I really thought you had her. Zelena shot him a look. She would have won if not for Hesper's dirty tricks. Zelena turned back to Sarah to explain. Her semblance creates aura threads. She set you up from the start. That... Sarah paused to inhale once more. That just means I was careless. Her voice was raspy from having the wind knocked out of her. Hesper won fair and square. We fought each other head on, and I lost. That's all. Zelena was surprised to hear Sarah defend Hesper after everything she did, but they'd have to talk about it later. For now, Zelena helped Sarah to her feet, while Piers retrieved the weapons that she had thrown. They then began the trip back to their dorm room, past the stares of their classmates. All three of them could feel the weight of this loss. Hesper had won, and word quickly spread throughout the class that their Elysian problem wasn't going to go away so easily. But to hear more about that, you'll have to wait for the next chapter of Team Seraph's story. So in the meantime, please let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments down below. This was my first time writing a detailed fight between two characters, and honestly, I think it turned out pretty well, but I'd love to know if there's anything I can improve on, or what you guys think of it in general. What did you think of the outcome of the fight? Based on the comments on the Chapter 6 video, I imagine this might have been a bit of a surprise. So I really do look forward to seeing what you all thought of it. And if you enjoyed this chapter, then make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame to make sure you're notified when more chapters are posted. And if you ever want to discuss Seraph, or OCs, or RWBY in general, as well as like anything else for that matter, feel free to join in on my Twitch streams. I stream every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and I'd love to see you all there. But with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.